Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are covering a topic that I've actually had quite a surprising amount of requests to talk about, and that is how the UNSC in Clad was infected by the Flood. Now, to be fair, I can actually kind of understand why so many people want to see this video, because Halo 2 really does leave its infection as somewhat of a mystery. The last that we see of the Clad before it was infected is above the library on Delta Halo, just after it drops off Miranda, Johnson, and their squad of Marines to go and retrieve the Index. And then it shows up only one mission later inside High Charity, and it's somehow completely infected by the Flood. So today, we are going to try and get to the bottom of this floody mystery. So firstly, Miranda and Johnson obviously came to ground in a Pelican before riding the gondola into the library, and the area that led up to the gondola station, where they likely landed, was completely overwhelmed by the Flood. When they then got to the library, most of their squad were then killed and then likely infected by the Flood, which only added to the ever-growing number of combat forms that were swarming the structure and trying to stop the humans and also the Covenant from retrieving the Index. While all of this was going on in the background, the Gravemind was continuing to take control of the ring, and the Flood was spreading elsewhere as well. On his way to the Sacred Icon, the Arbiter deactivated the containment shield in the Sentinel wall that surrounded the library. Now, this was a very, very bad move, because this shield was keeping all of the Flood trapped in the quarantine zone, but now, with it disabled, the Flood were able to pour out of the zone through the Sentinel wall and begin spreading across the rest of the ring. And with all of this happening on the surface of the ring, Keyes left the Clad in the worst possible place, in low orbit right above the Flood-infested library. What a smart move that was. Good job, Keyes. Okay, so now that we have what little we know on the table, we can look at two of the most likely theories that explain how the ship was infected. The first theory is that the Flood commandeered air transport and then flew up to the ship. So during the mission quarantine zone, we can see that UNSC-powered Pelicans are flying around, providing supplies and air support for the Marines that are helping retrieve the Index. Now, given that the Flood were in the coordinator stage of development during Halo 2, and that they had a Gravemind controlling them, and were clearly intelligent enough to pilot vehicles, it's highly possible that they commandeered a Pelican, maybe a crash Pelican, or maybe even the one that Miranda and Johnson came to the surface of the ring in, and flew it up to the Clad. Now, given the number of human combat forms that we saw in the quarantine zone, in particular when there's a crash Pelican nearby, the Flood definitely had sufficient knowledge from their hosts to know how to fly a Pelican. And when they've flown the Pelican up to the frigate, the humans on board wouldn't have been able to tell that it was a Flood control Pelican that was coming into dock until it was too late. They'd be entirely caught off guard with most of their armed forces down on the ring, and the Flood would be able to infect the ship with ease. The second theory that I have primarily focuses on good old-fashioned Flood spores. Now, it took the Gravemind less than a day to fully infect High Charity and for spores to begin spreading in its air. And given that it existed below Delta Halo's library for literally tens of thousands of years, and the fact that the outbreak was large enough to even create a Gravemind in the first place, I find it really hard to believe that, at the very least, the air in and around the library, quarantine zone, and Sentinel wall wasn't compromised by Flood spores. Now, I don't know if that thick green fog that you sometimes see in Flood areas is technically meant to indicate spores, but parts of the Sentinel wall are filled with it, so if it does mean that, then I guess that is proof that the area is spore compromised. However, I concur. Given that the Clad is in low orbit above the library in the ring's atmosphere, if the air was compromised by Flood spores, then they could easily have reached the frigate, and then infected its air filtration systems and begun infecting the crew members. Even if only a few spores manage to make it that high up, all it takes is for one person on board to be turned into a combat form, and then they can very easily spread the parasite by biting other people, transferring their bodily fluids, or by growing infection forms in their back. Now, of course, the two theories aren't mutually exclusive by any means. A Flood-compromised Pelican could have flown up to the frigate, while spores in the air infected its filtration systems, but I think both theories definitely have their own merit. At the end of the day, it doesn't take any mental gymnastics really to understand how easy it was for the Clad to be infected. Now, given that it was left in low orbit above the most dangerous location on the entire ring, presumably also without much defense, They practically left its front door wide open and just invited the flood in to be infected. Halo Ring Etiquette 101. Never, ever, ever leave your ship unguarded above the library. It just doesn't tend to end well.
That is really interesting. I never gave it much thought because of, like, oh, suddenly the ship is infected and oh, it's going down and blah, blah, blah. Like, I never really gave it much thought of, like, how it got infected. But now I'm like, oh, wow, because it kind of, at the time, before that explanation, it doesn't really make much sense about how, like, you know, Miranda and Johnson and some of the team, you know, like, they were in it, and then they went down in a Pelican, and da-da-da-da. Like, you kind of, like, don't really think that much about it. But then suddenly in the next level, it's suddenly infected, and it's going down, and it crashes. So, yeah, I really like the explanation where it was because it was in low orbit, and because, like, airborne spores and stuff like that, the flood were then able to take the Pelican that more than likely was the one that Miranda and Johnson and some of the crew members had. They got into the Pelican and went up to the Ember Clad. I like that explanation. That seems like the more probable cause of, like, what happened. Then, of course, you know, in Halo 3, Miranda and Johnson. So sad about that. So sad.